Namaskar. Welcome to this lecture on intersectionality in feminist research and methodology. My name is Divya Upadhyay Joshi and I am coordinator of the Women's Studies Center at Kumar University, Nainital, Uttarakhand. I will begin my lecture with a brief introduction to the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is considered one of the most important concepts in modern feminist research and writing. It is a theoretical and methodological framework introduced by American scholar, lawyer, and activist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 as a way of understanding and analyzing marginalizations due to socially constructed categories such as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and disability, by viewing them as creating extreme, compounded regimes of inequality, disadvantage, and oppression. Thus, it was understood that the traditional conceptualizations of social oppression, such as sexism and racism, do not operate independently of each other. Instead, various different forms of oppression intersect to create a system of oppression. Intersectionality also claims that distinct forms and expressions of oppression are in constant dynamic interaction and are also shaped by one another. Thus, the clear implication behind intersectionality is that there is no singular experience of oppression because of identity and patriarchy. As a theory, intersectionality has continued to be employed most often to investigate the intersection of categories, which result in compound disadvantage, thus enabling researchers to better investigate underserved or marginalized populations. But intersectionality is also being increasingly used to investigate categories of people who experience compound privilege. Example, urban upper class men, as well as categories of people who experience both oppression and privilege on differing dimensions. Example, urban upper class gay men. Let us now look at some definitions of the term, which is regarded by many as one of the most important contributions to feminist theory. There are many different definitions to be found. A general definition of intersectionality is the view that women experience oppression in varying configurations and in varying degrees of intensity. Cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated but are bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society. Examples of this include race, gender, class, ability, and ethnicity. Kathy Davis, 2008, uses the following simple definition: the interaction of multiple identities and experiences of exclusion and subordination. And Catherine Smythe, 2017, explains intersectionality in this way: an intersectional feminist perspective insists that gender cannot and should not be studied in isolation from race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, or other structures of power, because they do not exist in isolation from one another, but instead always intersect. In all these definitions, there is implied an important basic distinction between personal kinds of identity and structural identities. The law conceptualizes people through the structural identities of gender, race, sexual orientation, or national origin. These kinds of identities are different from personal identities of the sort that refer to personal taste, personality, traits, gender performativity, or intimate and filial relationships. Lived experiences provide the possibility of exploring how intersectionality works in practice. Lived experience is the existentialist experience of being a subject, of being human. The subjectivity of experience cannot be separated into neat categories of gender on the one hand and, for example, caste on the other. The experiences are simultaneous, linked, and contextual. Intersectionality is primarily an organizing principle which calls for reflexivity in the study of special characteristics such that one marginality is not substituted for another and lived experiences are not treated as generic and undifferentiated. Thus, intersectional research also works to disrupt the assumption that identities are fixed and unchanging and explores identities as they shift and change. The genesis of the term can be traced to the legacy of Black feminism. The idea that patriarchy interacts with other systems of power, namely racism, to uniquely disadvantage some groups of women more than others, has a long history within the intellectual and political traditions of Black feminism in USA. In the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s, in USA, Black women experienced marginalization within the civil rights and women's movements. As a response to this exclusion, the first conceptualizations of intersectionality emerged in Black feminist writings. Black scholars, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, 1991, argued that an intersectional analysis consists of three main pillars. Firstly, that racial and sexual subordination are mutually reinforcing rather than distinct systems of oppression. This means that racial subordination reinforces sexual subordination and vice versa. Race and gender cannot be seen as mutually exclusive categories. Secondly, that Black women are most often marginalized by a politics of either gender or race alone. Thirdly, that a response to each form of subordination must be at the same time a response to both forms of subordinations. In the next section, intersectionality as methodology. Intersectional theory has become an increasingly popular theoretical and methodological approach within social research and is currently the primary analytic tool in both anti-racist and feminist theories across the world. But there are many challenges in the actual practice of intersectionality as a research paradigm. This has led scholars like Kathy Davis to label intersectionality as a theoretical buzzword. Leslie McCall argues that developing an intersectional methodology is difficult, partly because of the complexity of the term. Including multiple dimensions of social life and categories, which is, having so many variables to study, complexifies the final analysis. Not all established methods allow for such complex analysis, leaving a limited choice. For example, it may be particularly difficult to accommodate an intersectional approach within quantitative research designs that require that data be tested as per certain fixed statistical linear methods. In general, qualitative research is preferred to apply concept of intersectionality. This is because qualitative analysis permits a more complex analysis of social reality. Thus, for many authors, qualitative methods are ideal for looking for new and out-of-the-box ways of doing feminist research. Examples of methods that are compatible with intersectionality are participatory action research and ethnographic methods, such as qualitative interviews and case studies. Yet, so far, there is no standard way to implement intersectionality in qualitative studies. One way mentioned by several authors to apply intersectionality is to use the approach of asking the other question. This is an approach that Mari J. Matsuda, who in 1991 coined the idea, summarizes as follows. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? Asking the other question can be used as the starting point to apply an intersectional lens. Based on stages of research, scholars have categorized research strategies using intersectionality into 3 heads. While planning research, several steps can be taken to ensure research is intersectional. First, the way the questions are formulated is important. The questions must allow for intersectional processes to be investigated, thus leading to richer data which will indicate how social issues are experienced across intersecting social categories. For example, the question, do you experience discrimination on the labor market, can be framed as, what are some of the challenges you experience as a slum-dwelling, migrant, tribal woman on the Indian labor market? Second, the use of particular words shapes the way they are received by respondents. Finally, while recruiting the participants, it is important to ensure that the diversity among the research participants is as large as possible. Throughout the research, there are 2 main concrete steps to be taken: situating or positioning oneself and reflecting upon the categorization that is used. A first important strategy that can be applied during the whole research process is situating oneself, and the resulting reflexivity must be made central. This means to carefully consider one's position as a researcher within the research and acknowledge the position. What are your gender, class, ethnicity, religion, disabilities, sexuality, education, geographical location, and other characteristics that might influence the way you see and interpret the world? By discussing this, the researcher positions themselves within the topic and the methodology of their research. There are different ways of positioning oneself within one's research. One way may be to simply list the identities of the researcher, or do so by elaborating on the way in which your identities and characteristics influence you throughout the research. Positioning oneself helps to achieve feminist objectivity. Positionality in intersectional research. One must take the positionality of everyone involved in the research into account, not only of the researcher. There may be differences in gender, ethnicity, level of education, age, religion, and other characteristics. This should not merely be noted, but the effects of these differences on both the researcher and researched should be explored. Reflecting critically upon categories can be done by evaluating answers to several questions about who is included and excluded in the categories, the role of inequality and power in creating these categories, and the similarities between the categories. Strategies for analysis and interpretation include identifying at which specific moments the interviewee mentions a characteristic, such as gender, ethnicity, level of education, etc., in connection with specific experiences. While this would lead to an interpretation on the side of the researcher, a way to make it less dependent on the interpretation of the researcher is to contact the interviewee after the interview to check the researcher's interpretations. A second strategy while analyzing and interpreting the data is to approach the data from different perspectives. For example, you could read the data several times, each time with a different main question in mind. The challenges to intersectional research are many. Researchers continue to move away from this additive model and are currently grappling with various approaches that could account for the immense complexity of conducting intersectional research. In the next section, we talk about intersectionality in Indian society and scholarship. The term intersectionality is now increasingly being used in Indian scholarship in the past 2 decades. But even before that, we find that the notion of multiple identities co-constructing marginalities has been consistently discernible on the socio-economic and political canvas of India. From the early 20th century onwards, starting from the non-Brahmin movements in Tamil Nadu to the Dalit literary and autobiographical upsurges in Maharashtra in the 1960s, and even the continuous episodes of honor killing and atrocities, all illustrate the various complex ways in which caste, gender, and also class intersect to shape the everyday conditions of marginalities in India. The use of intersectionality to understand what social reality was, however, was not reflected in the mainstream women's movement in India till the 1970s. Although we can see the writings of reformers like Jyotirao Phule, E.V. Ramasamy Periyar and B.R. Ambedkar, an understanding of the dual or multiple nature of the oppression being faced by women in India. Up till the 1970s, the women's movement displayed an unproblematic acceptance of a homogeneous category of the marginalized woman, at best broken into class and rural-urban categories. While the mainstream Indian feminist community is criticized even today for being elite in its upper caste, middle class and urban affiliations, it has been reflexive of those limitations to some extent, such that much of their campaigns on livelihood and or sexual violence have been for poor and rural women. Caste and religion have often been compressed into a singular category of socio-economic marginalization, represented in the notion of women as backward classes, which has focused on poverty as the primary basis of marginalization. The specificities of the lived experiences of these backward women, which shape the marginalities, however, have been largely ignored. The concept of intersectionality can be seen clearly manifest in the theory and praxis of the contemporary Indian feminist movement. There are multiple debates within the Indian feminist movement drawing on not only gender but also sexual orientation, caste, class and other factors, and these have sometimes led to fractures within the activists. Writers such as Srila Roy have noted how Dalit Bahujan and other minority activists have invariably framed any controversy in terms of power imbalances between Savarna and Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi feminists, thus bringing out the invisible caste question within feminist movements and compelling the participants to engage with it. Scholars such as Purdy Vaughan and Ibach in 2008 identified intersectionality in India as seen in practice as proceeding along 3 channels of invisibility. Number 1, historical invisibility, through misrepresentation or de-emphasis in the mainstream historical narrative, which reproduces, in this case, Brahmanical patriarchy. Number 2, cultural invisibility, through the failure of cultural representations to capture the distinctive experiences of these subordinate groups by organizing themselves around the dominant prototypes, which are then stereotyped into generalities. And thirdly, Finally, political invisibility. Through the neglect by advocacy groups of the issues concerning these communities. Critics such as Srila Roy and Sharmila Rege have pointed out that Indian feminism has, in practice, mostly adopted a unilinear, normative, gendered approach while developing strategies for intervention. The materiality of women's marginalities cannot simply be collapsed into a generic class category. This has resulted in reproduction of margins and hierarchies within the women's movement, where the power imbalance between the castes has persisted, but in an invisible form. Women from different regions, religions and ethnicities, whose unification is sought on the basis of systematic overlapping patriarchies, are divided along caste class lines, which affects their mode of consent to patriarchies. Dalit feminist studies have, in the last 3 decades, drawn increasing attention to the question of caste and gender intersectionalities. This is evident in the development of the Dalit feminist standpoint as a critique of the masculinization of the Dalit and Dalit studies and Savarnization of the woman and women feminist studies. This trend acknowledges the multiplicity, heterogeneity and even contradiction arising from lived experiences of an individual and or of groups, and also the resultant hierarchical, multiple and changing power relations of caste, class, race and ethnicity which construct their social realities. One of the most important interventions in the Indian feminist discourse in the contemporary period has taken place through Dalit literary writings. Autobiographies by Dalit women in different regions of the country, example, Kalyani Thakur or Chandalini in Bengali, Bama in Tamil, Urmila Pawar in Marathi, among others, represent the creation of a counter-narrative built on lived experiences located through a complex intersection of caste, class and gender. These autobiographies, as very diverse life narratives of struggle, oppression and humiliation, disrupt the singular communitarian notion of the Dalit community. While intersectionality is an important analytical tool for understanding complex Indian social realities, it has limitations which have been critiqued by various scholars. Nivedita Menon, 2015, provides an important critique of the usability of the intersectional framework for feminism in India. Much like Rita Kaur Dhamun, 2011, she has argued that from feminists of color to post-structuralists, there has been a consistent and uniform theorization of multiple and interlocking vectors of identities. Works variously identified as multiple consciousnesses, multiple dimensionality and interconnectivities have demonstrated how the interlocking and constitutive nature of social characteristics fractures the idea of homogeneous and singular experiences. In conclusion, I would like to say, the critiques of intersectionality have feared that it results in the fragmentation of the opposition to structural oppression, which is not good for the feminist movement. Yet, intersectionality is an important aspect in terms of comprehending contemporary feminism in the context of the fourth wave of feminism. Intersectionality is thus both a theory and a praxis, both an analytical and political tool wielded by those facing multiple subordinations. It can be a powerful mechanism for building coalitions across diverse marginalities for the purpose of confronting and combating the interlocking systems of power that shape women's lives. Intersectionality is an important tool both in theoretical and empirical knowledge production, and in activism, advocacy, and reflexive pedagogy. Thank you for your attention. I hope the lecture has helped you to understand the meaning of the term intersectionality and also how it is used in the context of feminist theorization, of feminist research methodology, as well as in feminist activism and advocacy. It is one of the most important concepts in modern and contemporary feminist studies, and its application in your research designs will help you to enrich your work according to contemporary standards. Thank you. Namaskar.